everybody, welcome to PubhD. This is the 18th one in Dublin. It started a few years ago in Nottingham. A group of science PhD students got together in a pub. They wanted to get together, meet other people who studied science, and it's evolved into an international organization now. It's in Poland, Vietnam, Portugal, and Ireland now. And it's to get people from humanities and life sciences and engineering and everywhere else together to come and learn about what we're doing and to make friends from different colleges. So we've got some good speakers today. We've got Maureen from Trinity College.
Hello.
Scott from UCSI. And Patrick from UCL.
Yes!
But before we get started, I'd like everybody to raise their glass and toast to Grace McDermott, who she was an author and creator on the blog Women Are Boring, and tragically she died this weekend. And she was really big into science communication and outreach, especially women in science, and showing that, showing the work that we all do as PhD students and as scientists, and just, I'd like to raise our glass to her. So,
Grace.
To Grace.
Grace.
Hi everyone, my name is Maureen Williams. I'm from the zoology department at Trinity College Dublin. And you might be able to tell from my accent that I'm not originally from here. I'm actually from America. So people often ask, why would you ever leave the sun of Florida to come here? And the short answer is parasites. So that might be a bit surprising and a bit jarring. We're going to have a little bit of a spooky talk here, but I'd like to start with something you guys might be a little bit familiar with. So how many of you have ever heard that a pregnant woman shouldn't clean a cat's litter box? Yeah?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any idea why? Exactly. So Toxoplasmosa gondii. It's a parasite that can get into humans. We're not the intended host. And actually, what happens to humans is if you're immunocompromised or if you're pregnant, you can have severe complications. However, like I said, we're not the target host of this parasite. The target host of this parasite, the final host where the parasite can reach a reproductive stage, is your normal house cat. That's where the parasite wants to be. In order for the parasite to get there, though, it has to live part of its life cycle in an intermediate host. So the intermediate host allows the parasite to grow and develop, but the parasite can't get all the way to maturity. In Toxoplasmosa, the intermediate host is a rat or a mouse. We're all familiar with those as well. We also know that normally mice and rats run away from cats. They're not friends. Tom and Jerry lied to us. They're not, good pals here. But what happens when you get a mouse or a rat that's infected with Toxoplasmosa is it no longer runs away from its predator, it runs towards its predator. So that's a pretty drastic shift in normal behavior. This is super interesting. It's definitely in the parasite's self-interest to get to its final host, to get to its cat. The cat thinks it's getting an easy meal, doesn't realize that it's about to get a parasite, and the parasite is able to continue its life cycle. So as interesting as all of this is, I think it's fascinating and terrifying. Real life zombies here. I don't want to work on anything that can infect me. Just straight off the bat, if I can catch it, I don't want to deal with it. So, in order to work on these sorts of questions, though, to kind of figure out, we know very much what happens when one host and one parasite interact. What we don't understand is when a bunch of hosts have parasites, what does that mean? Or if conditions change, how is that going to change in the future? So, if climate heats up, what's going to happen? So in order to study these sorts of questions, we use model systems. So things that we can culture in the lab that are easier to study, that are a little less dangerous. And this is where being from Florida kind of helps, in that I'm used to running around lakes, I'm used to running around rivers, and that's where we find my model system. So I work on a species called Gammarus. You can see one on my t-shirt. I'm a bit of a fangirl. I have my lovely crocheted gammarus, courtesy of my lab mate Paula. And you actually find these almost everywhere in Ireland. You find them in France, Germany, the USA. They're really common. But you find them everywhere from Cork out to Mayo, up to the north, down to, you know, the Dodder just right here. So they're really common, they're really abundant, and they live in almost all lakes and rivers in the shallow end. And what they do is a really undervalued job. They're kind of like the garbage men of the aquatic ecosystem in that they take in all of the dead matter, all of the detritus, all of the dead animals, all of the gross stuff, and they process that energy to make it available for higher trophic levels. So, you know, the things that are eating them essentially. But they keep this cycle going, and they're really, really important. So we know that they're important. We know that they do an important job. But we also know that they can get a really interesting parasite infection. So the parasite we're looking at here is an acanthocephalin, and that just means a thorny-headed worm. They're kind of a unique kind of group of parasites. But we know that when the gammarus is infected with an acanthocephalin, it changes its behavior to go towards the parasite's final host. So it does the same kind of manipulation, but in our model system. So what we're really interested in then is how does this behavioral change have knock-on effects? Or what's going to happen when this behavioral change happens at higher temperatures? Lakes here can get down to 3 degrees, which is pretty chilly. They can get up to 19 degrees, which is pretty warm. And that's a huge range that you're working in, that they could be, you know, the parasite-host relationship could be changing drastically. And we honestly just haven't until now really had any ideas what would be happening. So I do a lot of controlled experiments to get at the heart of what's happening here. The behaviors I'm looking at are pretty universally studied, but the reason that most of you might not know what a gammarus is because they're really good at hiding. So they love to hide, you know, behind pints, under rocks, in and around dirt, and they're very afraid both of light, and they also don't like to move upwards in response to gravity. So usually they stay at the bottom and they go to the darkness. What happens though is if you're infected, at lower temperatures and at higher temperatures, you're much more likely to go towards the light and to move up in the water column. So the final host here is a duck, or a swan, a water bird basically. And so the parasite is driving its intermediate host, in this case our gammarus, towards its predators. What's really interesting is that higher temperatures, we've been able to show that both infected and uninfected individuals are way more likely to be moving around and moving up. And so at higher temperatures, we expect there to be a lot more transmission. So kind of, you know, to tie it all back together, what does this matter? Why are we doing this? What's the important points? So the first one is that if these gammarus are moving upwards in their ecosystem, they're moving towards their predators, they're not doing their own jobs. So we have a real risk here of having a lot of detritus left over, a lot of energy that's not being used. And that could have huge knock-on consequences that we need to start thinking about if we're going to respond to things like climate change. Second of all, if we're getting higher infection rates in our swans and our ducks, I know that all of you must be, you know, as crazy as my friend Darren here and care about birds, right? You don't want your birds to have these huge parasite burdens. So again, we need to start considering what could be happening and how this behavioral change could drive those sorts of serious consequences. We also know that things actually seem to be a little more straightforward in this field than we originally thought they were. We thought this, you know, all of the modeling before this, all of the statistical modeling, not Paris modeling, has shown that they thought it was going to be a lot more of a complex interaction. And it's a little bit simpler than we thought, which is great for us if we're trying to manage these things. So that's a really exciting finding. It gives us a little bit of hope there. And where the really cool, really big implications are is that there have been some studies that suggest that humans might actually be modified, our behaviors might be modified by parasites as well. These are a bit controversial at the moment, but it's been thrown out there. If we want to respond to the challenges that face humans in relation to parasites, we have to understand what the parasites are doing at a basic level. And so hopefully our work in these model systems will give us the tools to take, you know, the advantages that we can take to protect human health in the next bit. One of the interesting cases is sandfly. I'm not sure if you've heard of this. It's a really big problem in the Middle East where you have a lot of deserts and a lot of humans running around said deserts. And they've actually shown that as temperature changes, the way that humans change their behavior could make them more vulnerable. It's really good to be able to see that the parasites might also be changing as well. We've shown that in our system. And so we could perhaps add those sorts of changes in as well as we predict what might happen in human health transmission there in the future. And I'm done if anyone would like to ask any questions.
Yeah, so I was going to do like an accent joke too, but then I was beat to it, so like I said, there goes like the first page. Okay, so I am from Canada. So like 8 months ago, I got this email and they're like, yo, it's RCSI, we need you to be at this postgraduate mandatory meeting. And I was like, cool, shit. Because at the time I was living in Toronto, which is like 5,000 kilometers away, and I was really, really far from Dublin. So in this like mad rush, I like subletted my apartment, sold all my possessions, and then came to Ireland. So touching down in Dublin, I think I got my final confirmation like on the Thursday. I landed on Monday morning. I was super jet lagged, and it was just madness. Okay, so but showing up to RCSI with all my luggage in hand, I was like pretty excited. Because RCSI, it's got this great reputation as a medical college. It's got a really great undergraduate program for that. But it also has this great reputation as a research institute. And they're doing like all this great stuff in microbiology and immunology and physiology and whatever else. I don't know what you guys do. But sort of thinking back on this was a bit of an issue for me because like I'm not a microbiologist, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an immunologist, I'm not a physiologist, I'm not a geneticist. And despite working in the Department of Pharmaceutical and Medicinal Chemistry, I'm not actually a pharmaceutical or medicinal chemist. And so I'm a quantum chemist, and I'm frequently asked, like, Scott, what's a quantum chemist, and what the fuck are you doing here? So I laugh. And then I'll make some joke about how I like to make things hard for myself, and I might be some kind of academic masochist. And then I stare off into the distance and wonder what the hell I'm doing here. Page 3. But that's why I'm here before you today, to talk about what a quantum chemist does, but more importantly, how something like quantum physics, which is like so fucking distant and abstract from what we do at RCSI, not only has a place just in the physics or chemistry laboratory, but also in modern medical research. Okay, so yeah, I am going to try and talk about fluorescence guided surgery. It's going to be mostly about quantum mechanics, but we can talk about it afterwards, and we'll figure something out. We'll try and tie it all together. Yeah, so it's going to be mostly quantum. We're good. So I think like most of you are probably familiar with quantum mechanics, quantum physics. It's sort of at its most fundamental part, it's this mathematical description of reality at its finest structures. So like molecules, atoms, subatomic particles, and the stuff that makes up that stuff, which no one really knows what it is. And then you've probably heard phrases like, wave equation, uncertainty principle, and like particle wave duality, non-locality. And, because we're in Ireland, the sort of birthplace of John Bell of Bell's theorem, we'll throw that out there too. And then you've probably seen like videos of people and they're talking about like all the different ways you can interpret quantum mechanics and how weird and non-intuitive it is. My own sort of philosophical stance on this as a physicist is just kind of shut up and calculate, like I don't really care. Because to me, the sort of power of a theory in science is its ability to predict the outcomes of experiment from first principles. And nothing beats quantum mechanics at it. It's a very, very powerful theory in that regard. The central sort of concept of quantum mechanics is this thing called the Schrödinger equation, or the wave equation. And it contains sort of all the mathematical entities that you need to take a system and then figure out how it's going to evolve over time, sort of based on the laws of quantum mechanics. And It contains 3 things. I was going to try and memorize this, and then I just didn't.
Don't, you
So-
do well.
Oh, thank you. So,
You know he can read.
first thing is the Hamiltonian, and that is an operator, a mathematical operator, which contains information about the total energy of the system and how it's partitioned among everything that's in there. And then you have this thing called the wave function, which is a quantum mechanical description of the system. And no one really knows what that is. And if anyone tells you that they do, they're lying. And then we have this other, we call it like a spectrum of proportionality constants, which vaguely you can describe as the energy of the system, which sort of tells you what the probabilities of all the different possible outcomes of the system's time evolution are. And so if we're going to be like metaphorical for a little bit, we can sort of think of like the wave function as this oracle, and then the Hamiltonian is like this question that we craft to ask the oracle something, and then it returns an answer in the form of these proportionality constants. And from that, if we're clever, we can sort of derive any physical observable we want about the system. Alright, so as a quantum chemist, I use the tools of quantum mechanics to study chemical systems. So for me, a wave function is something that describes, say, the atomic orbitals or the molecular orbitals of your molecule. So you've probably all seen like a 1s or like 2p orbital or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if you have, if you haven't. I know you have. Yeah. And then a Hamiltonian is this thing that describes like the momentum and position and say Coulomb interaction of nuclei and electrons, and then whatever other part of the system I sort of want to interrogate. So it might be an external electric field, magnetic field, whatever. So for me, what's interesting is, or what I'm interested in, is sort of the interaction of light with molecules and how the structure of a molecule dictates its what's called excited state dynamics or photophysics. So whether or not an absorbed photon will be emitted as fluorescence or phosphorescence, or it might just get dumped as heat. So using math, computer modeling, a lot of coffee, and sometimes alcohol, what I try and do is I try and calculate and simulate the properties of molecules without ever actually having to make them. So I'm hoping at this point the sort of connection to fluorescence-guided surgery might be starting to crystallize in a few of your minds. I'm seeing some tentative nods, that's good. You're a lot smarter than I am. So the lab that I work in develops light-activated drugs that are used in visualization, diagnosis, and even treatment of cancers. Bold claim. Now, okay, so visualization. That's being able to see a tumor is like really super important. And over the decades, medical science and all those other people have developed some like really cool technologies to be able to do this. We've got MRI, PET, photoacoustic spectroscopy, optical coherence tomography, like a bunch of stuff. And all of these can and are be used depending on what country you're in and what's approved. It's still the Wild West out in Canada. There's no laws. Just kidding, we have a lot of them actually. So yeah, so for visualizing like tumor location and margins, we do that to plan and guide surgeries. And for something like, I don't know, over 50% of non-skin cancers, surgery is the primary method of treatment for your cancer. And the idea behind it is pretty simple. Like, if you can see a tumor, you can cut it out. And if you can cut it out, stick it in a jar, your outlook's pretty good. Cancer's in a jar, it's not in you. That's a plus. Unfortunately, reality is not often so kind to us. We're not really at a point where intraoperative MRI or PET or any of these other things are remotely feasible in sort of routine surgery. They're used often in sort of like specialized neurosurgery cases, but you're never going to get that done where you're getting some random lump removed. So the idea, despite the sort of best preoperative imaging that you can get using all of these different combined techniques, once you've opened up the patient, you're kind of stuck just to using sort of your eyes and hands to like look and feel around and like see where everything is. I've never done the surgery, but I've gutted a few deer, and once you're sort of in there, so once you're in there, everything looks pretty much the same. So it's kind of hard to tell. And so the surgical team, once they're inside, relies on visual cues and palpation to determine tumor margin and invasion into the surrounding structures. Which is, you know, we're doing the best we can, but it's obvious that if we had some kind of method to easily discriminate between cancerous and non-cancerous tissue, without all these like giant MRI machines and whatever else we happen to be using, would be like really, really great for intraoperative imaging. Almost there. So, in this regard, the development of near-infrared fluorescence-guided surgery is a mouthful and has also bridged this gap. So, the idea is that by injecting a patient with these sort of fluorescent molecules or fluorophores, we can selectively target tumors or whatever the sort of tissue of interest happens to be. And then with sort of like really simple optical systems, we can visualize fluorescence-tagged tissue against a backdrop of non-fluorescent normal tissue. And then, so if you're the surgeon, if it's glowing, cut it out. Easy. Anyone can do it.
Surgery by colors or by numbers, yeah.
So yeah, a few fluorophores already exist for this. So you might have heard of methylene blue, or indocyanine green, or some other series of acronyms, which I don't really know what they are. And they've been used with a good deal of success for sort of doing this intraoperative imaging during surgery for a variety of things, and they're starting to be used for you know, figuring out cancer margins and whether or not a sentinel lymph node's been infected, and you know, stuff like that. But we're a long way off from sort of fully realizing the potential of this fluorescence-guided surgery. So, for a fluorophore to be a successful candidate for fluorescence-guided surgery, it needs to meet several criteria. So it needs to selectively target the tissue of interest, and it needs to rapidly accumulate in it. And what would be really great is if it only fluoresced in certain environments, like the interior of the tumor. That way, like, you know, if it's in there, it's lighting up, and if it's not in there, it's not lighting up, so it's like really easy to tell. And you want it to be small and non-toxic. Narrow absorbance and emission bands, which are well separated from each other. You don't want something to be absorbing in the same sort of optical region it's emitting, because then it like absorbs itself, and it's like this weird thing where it's emitting into itself and nothing happens. And you want those absorbance and emission bands to be sort of in this what's called the NIR, or near-infrared tissue window. And canonically, that's between 650 and 1300 nanometers, but the sort of sweet spot is like right at 800, 900 nanometers. And then you also want to have what's called a high quantum yield of fluorescence, which means that if it's absorbing a bunch of photons, you want all of those photons to be emitted as fluorescence and not as phosphorescence and not vibrationally quenched or whatever other photophysical process. That way, it's really bright and it's really easy to see. So traditionally, in a synthetic chemistry lab, we would start with some kind of central fluorophore. For the lab that I work in, it's something called boron difluoroazodipyromethane. I'm not an actual chemist, I'm a physicist, so just relax. And then, I don't know what chemicals are. And then we add on different functional groups. And so we might do that to try and reduce the homo-lumo gap to redshift the absorbance and emission of the molecule. And then we might try and do something to increase the Stokes shift to send that emission band just farther and farther away from the absorbance band. Or we might try and rigidify, or whatever that word is, I'm also not a languager, to prevent other de-excitation pathways, such as heat or your phosphorescence or whatever. But there are situations where those might be good, and we can ask me about that later if you want. Or you might want to make it more soluble in water, or link your molecule to some other kind of sort of targeting biomolecule. So there's a lot of parameters to optimize, you can see. And trying to sort of simultaneously address all of these problems makes this like crazy massive search of like hundreds of different potential modifications, which when you consider like the 7 or 8 different parameter spaces we're trying to look in, makes like thousands and thousands of possible sort of potential modifications we can make to a molecule. And each of these modifications might take, you know, a couple months individually to synthesize and characterize. So finally, that's where I come in. So my goal, and what I'm trying to do, and I recently got a grant from the Irish Centre for High-End Computing to do this, was to develop a method for computationally screening sort of potential candidate molecules against all of these different criteria and predicting which of these modifications are most likely to sort of globally improve the characteristics of these fluorophores. And the idea with that is that we can potentially reduce the number of molecules that we might have to look into from the thousands into just dozens if I can do math, get physical properties out of it. And so the idea, wrapping all of this together, final statement, you've listened to me talk long enough. The idea is that by taking the chemistry and the physics that sort of underpin absorbance, fluorescence, and optics, solubility, pKa, whatever it happens to be, whatever you want to know about a molecule, if we can translate that into the language of quantum mechanics, code that into this Hamiltonian that we talked about, this question that we asked, this oracle or wave function, we can try and rationally design new molecules from first principles for better outcomes in fluorescence-guided surgery or whatever the hell else you want it to be. Thank you.
So I'm doing a bit of like Rider Haggard. I'm also doing Rudyard Kipling. I don't know if you've heard of Kim, about this like Anglo-Irish boy who goes on like a preamble around India, and I'm also doing Jocko the Bushveld, which I'm sure none of you have heard of. It's about like a transport rider in South Africa who had a dog and wrote a really, like, it's world famous in South Africa. It really is. I mean, like, we're really amazed that you all haven't heard of this book, because we all love it. Also doing Bram Stoker, not Dracula, but The Snake's Pass, a bit of Conan Doyle, The Lost World. Don't confuse it with the Steven Spielberg movie, but it's basically the same premise. They go to South America and there's this big plateau. But anyway, I'm talking about space and time, and it grapples with like empire and coming of age, and you know, like Jacqueline Rose, who questions. Yeah.
Just in the context of the works themselves, do you think the romanticization of colonized peoples made it easier to, not to humanize, but to make them items of fantasy, to not make their living situation a reality? I mean, if you think of with Kim and his, you know, his summer holidays were to travel and meet, so it romanticizes that native philosophy and makes it seem less real.
Yeah.
And so the actions, any action that you take that might negatively harm them doesn't really matter, because
I mean, it's like it's a fantasy space, and they're in a carefully delineated space outside of the daily life of white people, and like, I mean, you can see the continuation of the sort of Hell or Connor thing in Ireland in terms of India and Africa, where Haggard, who was a colonial civil servant, actually said, yeah, we've got to keep Africans in the locations, you know, and keep this white colony separate. And yeah, you know, they're a sort of fantasy land that's part of the past, you know, like, you know, they're lost in historical time, because, you know, like they're just like big children, and, you know, like, it's great, it's a fantasy world. Don't worry about this, we'll live in our own white society. And, you know, like, having grown up in South Africa where I saw apartheid firsthand, yeah, like, this was Haggard's theories, like, put into practice. But then both he and Fitzpatrick actually, like, found themselves saying, well, actually, we don't have any more space for white people to settle. We actually have to assimilate black people and educate them. So that is a fantasy, like I was saying at the end, you know, like, you have this guy who's like lost, it's ultimately the white adventurers that are lost to history. There's no more space for them. So it's like, it's time to assimilate the African and Indian people into the sort of our own chronology and just sort of deal with them as equal. So it's an idea that was very much of its time, but then it ultimately ran its course. And even the creators of this fantasy fiction, which in many ways is very racist, had to say, well, actually, yeah, this isn't reality. we've got to deal with the reality as we find it now. This has to belong to the sort of fictional adventure fantasy of the past. So yeah, I mean, like, it's something they were talking about at the time. You know, that they weren't sociologists or political scientists or, you know, like Rider Haggard's father told him, well, you're not fit to be a greengrocer. Fitzpatrick, like, didn't get the grades to get into university. Kipling left school at 16. You know, that they weren't sort of forward-looking thinkers. You know, they loved this adventure and fantasy. And then, you know, like, they sort of bought into their own propaganda, as it were.
Was your books they're for boys, obviously.
Yes.
So it's very gender specific. Were there equivalent books for girls? I mean, this sort of gender division was quite noticeable in the boys' adventure stories. But for instance, stories like The Wind in the Willows or Peter Pan are not gender specific. I think it's this very much the same era. But was there also that, this is another question really, that same sort of attraction for heroism, for, you know, being this special, brave, you know, heroic figure?
Yeah, no, there certainly was fiction for girls at the time. Again, very, like, you know, like they said, there's gender-specific stuff for boys, gender-specific stuff for girls, stuff in between. We had a very good speaker at the conference over the weekend who talked about, like, things like The Secret Garden, and, you know, like, there's stuff like that as well. And, like, you know, Louisa May Alcott, I know she's an American, but wrote about yeah, like Little Women, you know, like, again, that's also space, you know, this woman's space. Well, the war is happening somewhere else, you know, but like this adventure that happens in it. Yeah, absolutely. It is. I mean, I grew up reading this kind of fiction, and I sort of, you know, because I grew up in a colonial environment where it's sort of space outside time, it makes it very easy for me to relate to, and I have a natural interest in it.
But the Brits back home were reading this as well.
Yes.
It wasn't just you guys out in the colonies, it was sort of...
Yeah, no, it was. I mean,
really...
I mean, I should probably declare my own sort of interest in it. It's very related to family history. I mean, some of my family were settled in Africa in 1820 after the Napoleonic Wars. They were ex-soldiers. And much like they did in Ireland with Ulsterization, they said, right, we'll give you some land. And, oh yeah, you'll have to defend it from the people we've taken it from. You know, it's like, it's a tried and tested British policy, and it started in Ireland. And it's like, I have connections to Northern Ireland as well, you know, like Ulster Scots, I know it very well. My father's father was actually from Southampton, and he was educated in Cambridge. And he went out, he was on his way to India, I believe, to work in the Indian Civil Service. And he got off in Cape Town, decided he liked it, and stayed. And he ended up founding a school. But, like, you know, he sort of at a loose end, and he had to join the police. And so my uncle, who was a great raconteur, told me the story as he went to go and fill out a recruitment form for the South African police, and it had all his degrees on it. And this recruiting officer comes up and says, "Hot now, Mr. Rogers, all we need to know is, does you got your standard 6? It's like 8th grade." You know, like, so he started a school out there, and, like, you know, he taught like it was a sort of private school. You know, there was a big market for that, as now, back in sort of apartheid South Africa, where black people were kind of kept out of white schools, and, you know, like the idea of the elites, and there were a lot of sort of different private schools catering to different markets for people who didn't want to go into the mainstream, which is how I developed an interest in children's literature and education and that kind of thing. Any other? Yeah?
So this is, I suppose, just for the benefit of non-lit heads, I think.
No, normally it's for the benefit of non-science.
Like, I'd be interested to hear you speak about the relationship between, like, the parentless space. So a key trope in children's lit is, you know, if you think about Harry Potter to Alice in Wonderland to Kim, as you speak about, these stories all happen in the absence of parents. And there's a direct connection between colonisation and the parent and the imposition of time and space and things like that. So that's probably bringing you right back to your ABCs, but if you could talk about that.
No, it does. I mean, like, there is an absence of parents in all of these spaces, and I mean, like, I'm sure, like, the idea of having an adventure, you know, like, it's things you need to work out for yourself in the absence of, like, parents, because, you know, like, when something happens at home, your parents get involved and they pick you up and they, like, fix whatever mess you've made, and they sort of send you to your room for a while when you've been bowled and do that sort of a thing. This doesn't happen, and, like, the child or the sort of young adolescent works it out for themselves. So they cross all these thresholds and boundaries and things like that, and, you know, they cross them all again and again, and it's like they sort of find their own independence, and they sort of learn all these lessons for themselves in the great big bad world, but, like, ultimately nothing bad happens to them. There doesn't seem to be any harm coming to them, you know, and, like, it's a clearly evident thing. It's like sort of a safe space outside of time. Yeah, I mean, does that answer your question? Do you need me to elaborate even more?
We'll talk after. We'll talk.
Okay, yeah. Any other questions?
Just really quick before I finish, like, when these stories were written, do you know what the literacy rate was between boys and girls?
I don't know offhand, I have to say.
No clue?
No clue. I
You're
mean,
not going to be sending the boys to or girls out to colonise your empire. You know, I think that was one of, like, the key hints in.
Well, the literacy didn't need to be necessarily going to colonise. Just need to be able to kill something.
My grandmother is going to argue with the colony.
In fact, Nolik, I will take a point of order there. They weren't sending the women out to colonize. I mean, like, you know, they were women in roles, but in fact there was something called the fishing fleet. Which was like, you know, women used to go out to India to find themselves, like, wealthy, successful husbands. And they would refer to that as the fishing fleet.
Okay.
So, you know, like, the women played a role in this. Women are notoriously absent from many of these texts. But, you know, like, I think the role of women in the empire is definitely something to be explored, because certainly there was a couple of ships sent out to South Africa. I think the Lady Kenaway and the Jintu, that were sent out with Irish women on board who were supposed to be wives for some of the colonists. Yeah, I mean, it actually happened. There's a place
They're not having this adventure.
Well, I'm sure it was very, very challenging in its own way at its particular time. So yeah, I mean, it, like,